All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is our Science of Flight. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen for all of you. We got a lot of people joining us, which is great. We're going to keep letting them in. I'm going to share my screen for you all. All right. All right. So hopefully everyone can see this. We're going to be talking about flight today. So my name is Monica McCoubry. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. I've been doing Science of now. This will be the fourth year. And so we started it during COVID as a way to reach a broad audience across the state, and it kind of took off. And I learn a lot by doing these, and I think a lot of other people learn a lot by doing these. So I really enjoy them. So if you have any ideas for new science ofs that you'd like to see. Granted, we have quite a few already, but there's always more topics to cover. When you do your evaluations, that would be something absolutely awesome to put in there. A lot of the ones that we've done or I have done have been ideas from other people. So obviously, I want to know what you all want to learn about, and that helps us a lot as well. So today we're going to be talking about flight and how that looks in other animals and how it evolved over time and how other animals do it. So just a reminder to everyone, please be sure to be kind to everyone as you type in the chat your questions and your comments, and that we're also staying on topic and being relevant to what's being discussed today. Otherwise, we do have that right to remove you from the program. I also want to point out that I am by no means a flight expert. I am a science communicator expert, and so I take the research that other people have done and that other things that I find, and then kind of compile them all together in a digestible form so that people understand what we're talking about, and that have that really easily accessible for them too. So I love science. I do a ton of research for these programs. So if you have questions that I can't answer, which has happened before, I will find someone that can answer those for you and then get back to you with those answers. So please type questions in the chat if you have them. Please ask comments or ask questions and have comments. So, all right. Next, we're going to go ahead and start with like the origins of flight. So usually during our Science of programs, we talk about evolutionary history. It kind of helps to understand how this evolved over time and where we are now and how it's changed. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is like, where does flight come from? Did every single flying thing come from a single ancestor, or has it evolved over time into separate groups? It's kind of a mixture of both. So obviously, like a dragonfly and an owl are not anywhere close to the same type of organism. And so they have different common ancestors over time. So we're going to talk about that today. So first thing we need to talk about, though, what is flight? How do you describe this in an animal? So flight is a type of locomotion. So very similar to something like swimming or running or walking. It's a way for an animal to move from place to place. So technically, an animal that flies, there's two different types of flight, because of course there is. There's one that's called winged flight or true flight. Sometimes people call it powered flight or true powered flight. There's a lot of names for it. And then there's also gliding. So gliding is not necessarily true flight, but is under that same category. So we have this winged true flight that's only found in a very few animals. And then we have something that we talk about as something that is not necessarily a powered flight with input, but it is something that animals and organisms do. All right. To be able to fly, animals have to have certain modifications to their bodies. It's as much of us, however, many of us have dreamed to fly, and maybe taken some steps, getting off of the ground or jumping really high, flapping your wings, trying to move and to fly. We just cannot do it without an airplane or something else. So, but animals can, and so they have to have modifications to their body as a way for them to be able to fly. So when we're talking about warm-blooded animals or those vertebrate animals, they have to have some type of different types of muscles. They have to have different different types of modifications to their limbs. So their forelimbs have turned into wings. Here's a perfect example of these geese here. They don't have hands like we do, but instead they have wings. They also have to have a light and a fusion of bones. So lightening of bones and a fusion of bones. So something that flies cannot be super heavy. That just doesn't make sense. We're not going to talk about airplanes today. We're talking about flying animals. So obviously airplanes are ginormous and they weigh a lot, but we're not going to worry about them today. We're going to talk about a bird. We're going to talk about a bat. All of these things that can fly, they're going to have a lightening of their load and also a fusion of certain bones in their body so that they can fly. They're also going to have a pretty short torso. So this torso area of your body, it's not going to be super long because that doesn't really work with flying. So it's going to shorten. And then there's also an enlargement of the heart and those thoracic muscles. So the heart has to be really large. You're pumping your wings. You're going very long distances. There are some animals like birds that their heart will expand when they're flying and then shrink back down when they're done making their migration routes. Very similar to those thoracic muscles. They're going to have to work very hard and they're going to have to be a little bit larger than an animal that doesn't fly. And then also improved vision. There's a lot of things up in the air that are happening. These animals need to watch out for obstacles. They need to watch out for each other. And so they're going to have usually very good vision when we talk about animals that truly fly. All right, so here, I know we've all seen an animal that flies, but I do like to put videos in here. I'm a big visual person. So here's a great example of an animal that's flying. We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly is necessary for true powered flight. Like, how do we know an animal's truly flying and not gliding or falling? So I want you to kind of watch this video one more time. It's pretty short, but look for things that if someone asks you, how do you know this animal is truly flying and not gliding or soaring? How do you know it's doing this? So there's certain characteristics that animals have to do to make them in that true flight category. All right, so why would an animal need to fly? It seems like it's a lot of work. It's really fun, but I don't think that's what maybe animals think that. I don't know. I don't want to speak for them. But when animals fly, why do they do this? So evolution does not act with intelligence. It acts because the animal needs something to survive. So it favors those individuals that have certain traits, and that's what helps them survive over time. So an animal that has gained that ability to fly, it's probably better able to escape from predators. So how many of you times have you tried to sneak up on a bird or maybe even a bat or an insect and you want to get a closer look at it and all of a sudden it flies away? And it's very frustrating for us trying to take a photo or trying to look at something, but you are seen as a predator and that animal's trying to get away from you. So scientists believe that this may have been a huge driving factor in the evolution of bird and insect flight. So they are simply trying to escape a predator and evolution chose these characteristics and those traits for a reason because they were being successful. And over time, they've learned that it was a great way to escape those predators. An animal is also in a better position to catch something like a flying insect or a fast-moving prey if they're able to fly. So that opened also a whole nother unoccupied niche of things that animals can do. So all of a sudden you have these flying insects and no one can catch them, but then one animal all of a sudden is flying and they're able to catch all of them, and it's kind of fun and it's a great way to get food that other animals might not have that opportunity to. So it opened new food sources and also a lot of those unoccupied niches, but also again, better able to move around in their environment and also to escape predators. All right. One of the things I did forget to mention too is if you think about birds and bats, that's going to be the main things that we're talking about today that fly. Birds have this cool niche because they're during the daytime. Bats have found that overnight or those nocturnal niches, they were able to exploit those food sources, those flying insects at night. So you have two animals that are doing and performing the exact same thing, but one's doing it at nighttime for the most part, and one is doing it at daytime for the most part. I say for the most part because there's nocturnal owls, there's nocturnal animals or birds, but then also some bats are sometimes out during the daytime. So there's always exceptions. All right, so again, origin of flight, it was really hard to pinpoint I saw a lot of papers that it evolved 4 times, it evolved 3 times. So I put 3 to 4 times because I didn't want to be wrong. And I saw lots of papers that said different things. So this ability to fly over time has evolved separately at least 3 to 4 times in the past 500 million years of vertebrate history. So birds started to develop this idea of flying in the late Triassic. Bats started to do this about the early Tertiary period, and the pterosaurs, which you might not be familiar with, they are no longer with us. They are extinct. Um, but they were one of the first organisms that was able to fly, and that was in the late Jurassic time. So invertebrates have also only evolved 1 time as far as insects go, as far as how they can fly. So vertebrates have done this at least 3 to 4 times. They've evolved over time to fly. Insects, it only seems that they've evolved once to fly. So a little bit different there. But gliding is also something that vertebrates do a lot. We're going to talk about some animals today. How do you know if they fly versus glide versus parachuting, all these different types of ways that they move. But that is very separate from flying. So when we talk about and look at the idea of flight and how it's evolved over time, gliding is going to be something totally different. These animals that glide, they don't necessarily have to fly first. So it's not a prerequisite, or gliding's not even a prerequisite for flying, and vice versa. So it's not like an animal tried to fly and then didn't do well, so it went to gliding. It doesn't have to be one than the other. Some animals just glide and some animals just fly. Also, it didn't evolve from a single flying ancestor. So it's not like bats, birds, and insects all had a common ancestor. They just all evolved flying different times. And then instead, they all evolved the ability to fly separate from each other, separate ancestors that couldn't fly. So that makes a case for what's called convergent evolution, which we're going to talk about here. A great example, like a lot of you, if you think about this in ninth grade biology, you learned about convergent evolution. Possibly you did. You saw a um, diagram or a graphic of like a whale hand and like a fish hand or something like that. So they're similar in function and they're similar in looking, but also they're used in very different species and they look different. So um, it's pretty amazing for animals that are able to fly because it's not a large number of animals. There's obviously a lot of birds, there's a lot of insects, and there's a lot of bats, but that's not that many. When we think about the entire history of all organisms, there's not that many things that actually fly. So powered flight is difficult, and it comes with a lot of complex adaptations that animals had to evolve over time. So it's a truly what is called major feature of adaptive evolution. So when we talk about flight, flight stroke is definitely the defining feature of powered flight. So when you watch that video a little bit ago of that bird moving, you saw the bird was flapping. It wasn't just had its wings out and it was soaring. Flapping or flight, the stroke of flapping is defining feature in that powered flight. So they have to flap their wings, they have to be able to move, and there's some other things, but when you see something flap, that's usually the idea that they're truly flying. And then the morphology of the wing, so how the wing is made and how it looks. Those adaptive channels have basically converged in several different vertebrate lineages. So different vertebrates that fly, bats and birds is a great example. They're very different species, but we'll look at their wings and their hands here in a little bit, and it doesn't actually look that different. Other types of air travel, but the only true powered flight means that active powered flapping. So there's other types of ways that animals move through the air, but the only true flight of that powered flight is that, again, that active powered flapping. All right, so here's some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I just wanted to show you, this is a great diagram. It shows the different ways and the morphology of these animals that fly. So here's one, you have this bat over here. Bats are going to be mammals, so they're the only mammal that has that true powered flight. If you heard about flying squirrels, it's false advertising on their name. They're actually gliding squirrels. We'll talk about that later, but it's going to be very different. So mammals are the only true mammal that can fly, or bats. So here's what their hand looks like. So they're chiropterans, which means hand wing. So their hand is literally their wing. And if you look at it, it looks, you know, something like you see in Halloween, but they have a thumb, they have a first, second, third finger. It's very similar to people. It's just a little bit modified so that they can fly. This bird right here, they have a little bit different of a structure. So they have obviously wings and feathers, which helps them fly, but their wing is their hand technically. So it has a little bit different structure than that bat wing, but still has a fantastic way of flying over time. And then when you think of an insect, there are some insects that fly and they flap. Here's a little, it looks a little different than the other two, but it is still able to do the exact same thing. So it's easy to see how over time that these animals have evolved. So taking out those insects because they're invertebrates, they don't have backbones. Looking at the two birds and bats, those are the two that have evolved over time. And then when we say three ways that it has evolved, we include those pterosaurs. So these are these animals that were probably the first groups of animals that were able to fly. All right. So when we talk about the size of an animal, it has to be a correct size to be able to fly. So over time, the evolution of flight in both vertebrates and in invertebrates has led to a wide variety of these adaptations and these basically physiological adaptations to overcome these deficiencies. So what does that mean? So over time, they have to be the right size. They have to look right. They have to be able to fit this perfect mold so they can fly. So size matters. Basically, these various mathematical laws, smaller animals have to flap their wings faster to stay in the air. But there's also air resistance, which is a significant problem for these smaller animals. That means they have to have this basically effective minimum size for flight. So the smaller they are, the faster they have to flap. There are other factors that mean flying. Animals also can't be too large because the oxygen and the sugars that have to travel around their body, and when they take off, it's really hard for a large animal to take off. So if you think about a swan or an albatross, which is a very large bird, even though we don't have them in Nebraska, that's what's pictured here. But they have a very hard time taking off sometimes because they are so large. I think it's loons. Loons actually need a specific amount of like travel before they can take off. So if they get on a lake and the lake doesn't have enough space for them to take off, they can actually get stuck on the lake because they do not have enough basically runway for them to take off. So there's even though they can fly and they can do these really cool things, they also have to be a correct size. They also have to, there's adaptations for having smaller flight, there's adaptations for having bigger one, and there's pros and cons for each size. All right, so that was just like a little bit about like what is flight. We could talk about the origin of flight for an entire science of, but I want to talk about other things too. So we're going to talk about types of flight when we talk about these. So some that you might not think about as flying, even though we're going to group them together today. One of my favorite is parachuting. So it is not technically true powered flight because they're not flapping, but it is an animal that basically falls. The best way to describe parachuting is they're basically falling. I put this in here at the very beginning because I thought it was funny. The general definition of parachuting for an animal is an animal that can parachute. So that's the definition, but obviously it can parachute. So better definition is they are falling. When they fall, they have to fall at a certain angle between the direction of parachuting and this horizontal axis greater than 45 degrees. So technically that is a little bit more of a in-depth example of they have to fall at a certain way. Better parachuters fall more slowly because they have a lot more surface area relative to their weight. And so those drag forces, when we talk about things like drag and resistance in air travel, they're higher, which slows down the object of descent. So basically, this parachuting focuses maximizing those drag forces in order to slow the object's fall. Many plants use parachuting to disperse their seeds. Of course, humans have done it too. There's a lot of people that go parachuting when they jump out of planes and things like that. There's also some animals that we'll talk about later that technically parachute and not glide or fall or flap their wings. All right, so gliding is another one. So when I was looking at these, there's two types of flight. There's two types of gliding. There's a lot of different types of things. So gliding is one Gliding flight is one. It's two types. There's gravitational gliding and there's soaring. So gravitational gliding is an animal that launches itself at a specific target or a passive target, which could be parachuting. An animal that basically has a slow descent and it relies on wind for that horizontal motion. So a great example is a flying squirrel. So again, they are not flying, they are gliding squirrels. So when they go, they descend horizontally. So they're relying on the wind for that. And then there's different types of adaptations that these animals have to glide. They have wing-like modifications, sometimes of fins. There's going to be animals that fish, flying fish you've probably heard about. They actually glide. Sometimes they have webs between their digits. There's certain frog and lizard species that will do this, and they're able to glide using the webbing between their feet. Sometimes there are these creatures like Draco lizards. We'll talk about those in a little bit. They have these ribs that basically can flare out, and they have veins between them that help them move around, these folds of skins between their forelimbs and their hind limbs. Marsupials are a great example. So these flying squirrels, one of the things that they will do is when they go out, their squirrel suits. You've probably heard about people using them when they do like extreme sports and things like that, but it looks like from basically your front feet to your back feet, you have this little extra layer of skin. That's called a patagium. A lot of these animals will have that, and that helps them glide. So they do have different modifications to glide, but they're going to look very different than that of a true animal that flies. All right, so there's also soaring. So soaring is known as a sustained gliding without power input. So basically, they are not putting any power into this. They are using something else. They're using energy from the surrounding air, or sometimes they're called thermals, to keep that animal at a constant altitude. A lot of the times you will see turkey vultures doing this. They're soaring because it's a lot less work. Even though they can truly fly, they do also soar. So it's many birds, especially large species. So condors, albatrosses, even a few insects will do this, like monarch butterflies will do this. They'll use thermal currents to ride and to migrate from place to place. So in order to be airborne, the soarer must glide in a column of air that's rising at a rate basically exceeding the relative rate of descent. So it needs to be going up faster than it's going down. So this animal, like a turkey vulture, will be soaring, and you will see them even for a few minutes at a time. They will not flap their wings. They'll just hold them out and ride the currents. So a soaring animal does not flap its wings only to take off or land, and it makes slight adjustments while they're soaring. This form of flight has only been achieved by a few animals over the course of evolution. The larger pterosaurs that we talked about earlier, some large birds, they're really the only ones to known that have been able to do this. All right, so flying, true flight. So you can immediately tell if an animal is flying because of the way that it's moving. So you can tell it's an aspen because of the way it is, but basically it flaps its wings. So you will see this animal earlier. We talked about how it moves up and down. It's true flight. It is putting out an input to get an output. So true flyers have more control over their descent. They can flap their wings to produce a thrust for added speed and lift for added height. True flyers can also move horizontally, and they can even ascend at a steady speed. Unlike gliders and parachuters, they cannot do this. So basically, they fall. These guys that fly, they have more control over how they move up and down, and even horizontally, how they take off. They can do their steady speed, all this. Unless for parachuters, like a strong wind or something carries them up, they do not have that ability to go up. They're basically just falling down. All right, so that again, very small thing, but we're going to talk a little bit about flight in birds. So when you think of an animal that flies, most people say birds. That's a thing that they know, and they're not wrong. Birds are really good at flying. One of the things, this didn't really fit anywhere cool, or didn't really fit anywhere in this presentation, but I want to talk about it. One of the things that we don't think about too is hovering. So hummingbirds are like the champions of hovering. So this is a really cool phenomenon that is a good starting point, basically for humans to study how animals have adapted their body to be able to fly. So not all birds can do this. Not all animals can do this, but there are a few. Hummingbirds are like the best at it. So hovering just simply means that they're moving their wings so fast that they're staying in one spot and able to grab that nectar out of a flower or something like that. So it's really energy demanding, and it has evolved separately in birds, insects, and mammals that feed on that plant nectar. So bats sometimes can do it. Some species of bats can do it. Hummingbirds are able to do it, and insects are also can do some of it as well. So hovering does not really consume energy quite as quickly as chasing their prey or getting away from a predator, but it has to be sustained for longer periods of time, which means they need a huge amount of fuel and that ability to metabolize that energy efficiently. So basically, they need to consume around 5 times their body weight of fuel per day to be able to hover. So hummingbirds, we all know that they have a very long or very quick, rapid heartbeat, and this helps them burn a lot of calories as well. And they're always flittering around everywhere, but they need to consume 5 times their body weight just in fuel to be able to hover. And then their heartbeat's around 1,200 beats per minute during their flight, and they are exceptionally large proportion to the size of the bird. So they have a very large heart in ratio to their body as compared to other animals. So clearly a eagle and a hummingbird are very different sizes. They have very different hearts. But when you look at the ratio of how big their heart is compared to body size, it is comparable to that of something larger because their heart is beating so fast and they have to metabolize and use all this energy very quickly. All right. So we know the birds fly. So they fly by flapping their wings, they steer with their tails, and then very similar to an airplane, compared to the airplane and parts of an airplane, the bird's wings act as both a wing and a propeller. The basal part of the wing supplies most of the supporting surface, and the wing tip of the propelling force. So basically, this bird's wings has many adjustable features. They can be shortened and lengthened by the flexion of their body. So they can basically extend them and put them out and back. The feathers on the tip can be spread or closed. The angle of the wing or parts of the wing or side or both, they can be altered. And then of all these adjustments, basically this helps make the aerodynamics of the bird's wing much more complicated than those of an airplane. But the flight of a bird is much more varied and adaptable. So birds obviously can land quicker than airplanes can. They can move their feathers. They can adjust the shape of their wing. They can move their tail feathers. So all these tiny little adjustments basically help them fly better. All right, so the types of wings that animals or birds have, it does vary. Oftentimes, a lot of bird ideas can look at a bird and decide what type of bird it is based on the flight of their wings or their flight patterns or the shape of their wings. So there's lots of different types of wings. Different types of wings correlate with different types of flight. They're mostly for gliding or soaring. It helps the birds travel long distances. They escape from predators. They can find food. Some of them even use their wings for swimming or courtship displays. All birds will have wings, even though not all birds fly. If we remember to, like first or second grade, you can talk about animals like penguins, ostriches, emus, things that do not fly, but they still certainly have wings. All right, so what are the different types of wings? So there's active soaring wings. These are going to be really long and narrow. These are perfect for birds that glide over the ocean and for long distances. So this is going to be like your frigate birds, your albatrosses. They have these very long and narrow wings for those long distance soaring. There's passive soaring wings. They're very long and broad with large primary feathers. So these are there's different types of feathers. And so these are very long and large. These feathers help the bird catch thermals, those columns in the sky, without much flapping. These are going to be things like eagles and vultures. You have something called elliptical wings. They're short and rounded. These are quick takeoff birds. They're very agile when they fly through trees and bushes. These are going to be things like sparrows and crows. And there's high-speed wings. So these are going to be long and pointy. These are going to be animals like swallows and falcons. They're designed for very fast flying. And then you have animals that have hovering wings. So these are wings optimized for agile flight. This allows them to make quick turns, navigate complex environments. So these are going to be like your terns, your kestrels, and your hummingbirds. All right, so here's a kind of an image of what these different types of wings look like. They also show the different types of feathers. So those red ones, we talked about primary feathers, there's secondary feathers, there's all these different types of feathers, and they're on different locations of the body. If you also notice like high-speed wings, they look very different, and they have a lot more of those scapular like your shoulder blade basically. There are a lot more of those feathers than say like active or the passive soaring wings. So all birds have these types of feathers. They just look different because they have to correlate with the type of flight that they are having. All right, so also the tail shape is very important. So the shape of a bird's tail is also related to their flight. For instance, there's a great diversity of these. A lot of papers that I read also said that it's not really critical importance, but also I read some that said that it was very important. So the shape and the size of the tail does help with flying. It helps with changing directions, but overall the wing shape is what makes those animals able to fly and do those different types of flights. For instance, just a couple examples here, a forked tail in a bird, it helps them change direction and make these really cool intricate patterns. Ducks, for example, they have very short tails. They have swift but direct flights, and that's also found in things like doves and parrots. And then you have special examples like a woodpecker. Woodpeckers will drum on a tree. They'll use their beak to try and get those insects out of there, but the tails will actually use to help them prop up on a tree so that they can kind of steady themselves while they're drumming into a tree. So it does necessarily change the way they fly, and it does also help those birds, another adaptation that they can have. So here's a line drawing, actually. I found that was kind of cool. It just showcases the different types of bird feathers and their tail feathers. So you see like the deeply forked one, like number 3. Oftentimes a lot of like birds of paradise, so the tropical birds for the courtship displays, they'll have tails that look like 5 and 8. They're just like added extra little frills to impress the ladies. So this is just something that's different. All right, and speed. So the speed at which these birds fly also varies greatly. Individual birds can vary their speed. There's a lot of data on speeds of birds, but it's also hard to get because it's difficult to evaluate. And then one of the complicating factors is the bird's speed in relation to the ground may depend on the force of the wind. So despite the variables involved in determining a bird's speed of flight, things like the level that they're flying in, the sound, the generalized speed, it's all very difficult to get that. But we do know that the fastest bird out there is the peregrine falcon. When they dive, get over speeds of 200 miles an hour. But also a very cool thing as well I wanted to share. And then you have these birds that do these super long distance flights. So the record long range flight of a bird species in a single season is the Arctic tern. They migrate from the summering ground in the Arctic to the wintering ground in the Antarctic. They travel more than 11,600 kilometers each way. Some of these long range flights, they're made quickly, not necessarily the Arctic tern, but there are some birds that do long distance flights very fast. Some of these birds, also smaller birds, they make regularly long water crossings in a single flight. Albatrosses are one of those. They talk about how they could fly for like a year. So they do these very long distance flights. Here's an image of the Arctic terns. So some of these Arctic terns can live for 30 years or more. And then the total distance flown from some of these that have been calculated over time, it could exceed 2.4 million kilometers. That is equivalent to if you go to the moon and return 3 times. So these long distance flights are insane, especially for a bird. But again, they could not do these without their wings and their different adaptations and their abilities to fly. All right, and then you have the flightless birds. So there's a close similarity in the structure of flightless and flying birds. However, they do indicate that they all had a common flying ancestor. So somewhere along the way, they all had a common ancestor that flied, but then for some reason, some birds do not fly. Um, some birds have completely lost the power of flight over the course of evolution. They have really rudimentary rings. They are, again, they do not fly. Things like ostriches and penguins. But however, they do have that secondary specialized condition. The flightlessness is a secondary condition. It's a little bit more apparent in flightless birds. They belong to families who, over time, they do not have any animals now that are connected to flying. There are some analysis of how these animals have evolved and where they fit in. They're really closely related to something called the flying lemur. So very distantly related, but there's some statistics and cladistics that show that they could be related over time. So generally, the earliest known of these animals that have adapted over time, they've lost this flight. Mostly they live on isolated islands. New Zealand has a couple. There's no mammalian predators on that island, so they lost that ability to fly over time. And then another adaptation is their size. So usually these birds are very large. Can you imagine this ostrich flying? No, they're huge. Things like emus, things like ostriches, but even small things, smaller birds like small penguins can't fly either. So over time, they all had one single common ancestor that flied, and then over time, these started to break out, and some of them lost that ability to fly. All right. So that was our birds. We're going to quickly go through bats here. So bats are the only mammal that can actually true powered flight. So these Chiroptera or bats, they are the second most diverse group of mammals right behind rodents, and they're the only mammals capable of true flight. The evolutionary origin of Chiropterans is somewhat of a mystery simply because the fossil record for bats is scarce. There's not much to go off of. But the earliest known bats that appear in the Eocene epoch, they had long tails and they had other primitive flight adaptations. But for the most part, they are pretty similar to the bats that are found in modern times. All right, so here's a photo of a bat. There's lots of different things that bats have on them. They have different types of ears. They have different types of noses. Sometimes they have a bent wing. Sometimes they have what's called a simple wing. And then the very, very end down here, this little membrane or this tail looks very different in lots of types of bats. This is one of the things, besides their wings, that really depends on how they fly. Again, it really depends also, it correlates with their environments and what types of food they're looking to get. All right, so there's a lot of different types of features in bats that help them fly. They have what's called synchronized respiration, and so they can breathe and do echolocation at the same time for those that do that. That's pretty neat. Wing beats, they also are coordinated with breathing, and that breathing must be synchronized with their sound production. They have evolved the largest hearts and lungs relative to their body size of all mammals because, again, they're flying. And they have more lung surface area. They have high blood and hemoglobin concentrations, and they also have high capillary blood volume as well because, again, they're flying. They have to have all these special types of adaptations to be able to make those distance flights. All right, so here's a bat. Just again, a picture of them. You saw their wings earlier, but they do have a thumb. They have their wing membranes. They have a first, second, third, fourth, and fifth finger. So it's literally our hands. It's just in a different type of shape. So that helps them fly. But again, you can see those characteristics in mammals. Even with people and bats, you can still see same things. A lot of us, if you feel your ear right here, sometimes people get it pierced, but it's called a tragus. It's right here inside the bat's ear. A lot of the times that's an identifying feature in a lot of bats is trying to tell the species apart. You look at the shape of their tragus. We have one as well. So look at us. We're related to bats. All right, their skeleton too. So it has to be lightweight. There are many adaptations in their skeleton to help with flying. They're similar to the other two groups of those flying vertebrates, those pterosaurs in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. They were the largest known vertebrate to fly, and also birds. They have a lot of things like reduced bones. So their ulna and their fibula are shortened and they're thinner to help with flying. Their bones are a little more slender and lightweight. They have a keel on their sternum. So your sternum's right here, and there's a little bone known as the keel that helps with attaching those flight muscles. So everything kind of attaches right here on your pecs, and that keel helps them attach all those flight muscles. And they also have fused cranial bones just to keep them light as well. So here's a picture of their skeleton when you look at everything. So again, you can see those hand wings. They're known as phalanges. So again, your fingers. You can see all these different types of things. The scapula is the same. We have an ulna, we have a radius, we have mandibles. Sometimes people don't have zygomatic arches, but things like sorry, we do have zygomatic arches. Those are your eyes, my bad. But we also, lots of different things look the same. It's just, it looks different in different shapes in an animal, in a bat. All right, so the tail end, that tail I talked about earlier. So the birds, the wings are the ones supported in the bones and the arms. And their fingers. In bats, the wing membrane, known as the patagium, is supported by the arm, and then those four highly elongated fingers. The patagium extends all the way to the bat's hind legs and the tail, where it forms this uropatagium, which is supported by the foot bones, known as the calcars. Let's see if they're on here. Right here. So they're like a little tiny bone that slips off there. Sometimes they're called a spur, but the calcars around the ankle bones. The uropatagium, it helps bats fly and maneuver. For some bats, when they eat insects, when they fly to an insect, it also helps them kind of scoop up the insect. So they use it as almost like a little basket. It's not all the same in all the bats, but in some bats where they eat insects, it kind of scoops them up and then they're able just to like push them into their mouth. So it's an extra little adaptation that they can use to grab their food. So here's that tail membrane. It looks very different in lots of different types of animals or lots of different types of bats, but they all have a tail, if that makes sense. All right, so just the basics of flight. So bats move their wings like we use our hands to swim. They fly by rowing through the air. They can fold their wings into different shapes so that they can change direction quickly. They're also able to apply sudden brakes if they need to. They have very strong muscles in the back and chest that are able to help them do that. Some muscles pull the wings to an upstroke, and then some of them bring them down to do the downstroke. So thinking about it, those muscles are moving up and down. That's true flight because they are flapping. Also, flight is expensive. And when I mean expensive, it's like energy expensive. So 3 times as expensive as running and more expensive energetically than any other type of locomotion. And this is the flapping flight that we're talking about. All right. For this one, when an animal flies, it needs to generate lift, which is this upward force that's equal to or greater than the force of gravity. The thrust simply means the force to push itself forward and to maneuver. Drag is like that resistance in the air, very similar to when you fly in an airplane. Turbulence, a lot of you have heard about as well. The air has currents in it and it creates irregularities in their flow. So even birds and bats and insects have to deal with this stuff too. All right, lift is generated by the shape of the wing and the passage of air when it goes across. So bat wings are not flat. They are shaped like an airfoil, so they are irregular concave shape. So the wing curves, the air that moves over the top has to further travel to get across the wing so that it helps it speed up. This causes the air pressure above the wing to drop and it sucks the wing up. Meanwhile, the air below the wing has the opposite effect. So it slows down and more pressure pushes that wing up. Therefore, when the bat's moving, the air moving over its wings pulled up from above and pushed down from below at the same time. And that's how they flap their wings. Some bats have long or short wings. Larger wings require more energy of flapping, very similar to a larger bird. There also are limits to how large an animal's wings can be. Long, thin wings are good for flying fast and in a straight line. Short wings are good for flying slow and doing acrobatics. Large, broad wings are good for carrying heavy loads, but they're not very maneuverable. So the bigger the bird, the less maneuverable and agile it's going to be. Or the bat, sorry. All right, so we have about a few minutes left here. I do want to cover something that people may have heard as flyers, but they're not technically true flyers. But I think they're kind of neat to talk about, and I always like to talk about different things. So some of us have maybe heard of flying snakes. If you don't like snakes, this might be super terrifying for you, but the fact that we're grouping in snakes with birds is interesting. So technically, there's 5 recognized species of flying snakes. They're found in Western India to the Indonesian archipelago. They can't actually fly, so they can't gain altitude. So that means that they're gliders, not true flyers. But basically, they free fall and they contort their body so that they can move around. So to prepare for takeoff, these flying snakes will slither to the end of a branch. They'll dangle in a J shape, and then it will propel itself forward from the branch using that lower half of the body. It forms into an S shape and it flattens about twice its normal width, giving its body this really concave C shape. And it can trap air, and it moves its body back and forth, and the snake can actually turn while it's gliding in the air. They're technically better gliders than flying squirrels. They're equivalents to flying squirrels, so they do a better job at it. There's also flying fish. Again, flying fish, not capable of true flight, but they propel themselves out of the water at speeds of 35 miles an hour or more. But once they're in the air, they have these wings. They're basically just modified pectoral fins. They allow them to glide for up to 650 feet. That's quite a distance when we think about it. Another interesting characteristic of these fish, it's really hard to see, but they do have a forked tail, but their tail is not the same size. So the top lobe is shorter than the bottom lobe, and this helps them be able to kind of move in the air at the same time and propel themselves. And it's thought that fish evolved the flying mechanism to escape from those oceanic predators. So the idea is that if a predator chases them, they can propel themselves out of the water, and all of a sudden the predator's like, "Where'd you go?" Now, the only problem is that when they do this, they're great food for birds because birds know that they've seen fish do this. So they hang in that area and then they go down and scoop up those fish while they're in the air. So there's trade-offs. All right, here's another reptile. This is a Draco lizard. We mentioned them earlier, but there's a few species of Draco lizards. One of them is a small Draco lizard. It relies on gliding ability to escape predators, to find food, and even attract a mate. They live in the jungles of southeastern Asia. They have elongated ribs. So these are actually their ribs. They can extend their ribs and flatten them out, and they can retract them as needed. And then they have this membrane extra fold of skin that acts like wings when it's unfolded. When they're folded in, they just look like they have like a collar. Males are also very territorial and will use their gliding skills to chase other lizards from the trees that they feel like are their trees. Draco lizards also use their tails to steer, and they can travel up to 58 meters. They can also turn their wrists 90 degrees, so they can basically grab their wings while they're in flight. So they can hold onto their wings and kind of steer them like a squirrel suit. All right, and there's flying squirrels. So there's 50 different species. All are characterized by their aerial, flying, gliding abilities. Again, they don't truly fly, they glide. These squirrels can travel from tree to tree by jumping from a high branch. They stretch their limbs. You'll see them move like this. They have that patagium, that extra layer of membrane skin between their front feet and their back ankles. And sometimes they can even go up to 50 meters at a time. Which is kind of incredible for these little guys. And then you also have Japanese flying squid. So again, they don't really fly. They use jet propulsion to kind of propel themselves out of the water. Sometimes these guys are also known as the Japanese common squid. They're found in the North Pacific Ocean around Korea, Japan, and China. These guys have a really cool ability. They have this jet propulsion, and they can propel themselves out of the water. And basically what they use is they have this thing called the mantle. So this is the area where they take in water, and they can use this muscular cavity to protect the squid's body, but it also uses like a siphon. And so it's a tube that it can expel the water and the waste and the ink, and that is what they use to like jump out of the water. Once in the air, they can travel at 11 meters per second. It's also believed that the gliding ability is used to escape predators, but also to travel quickly. And they can move about 5 times faster through the air than they can the water. So who knows? Maybe in a few million years, we'll have actual true powered flying squid. Who knows? And that was it. All right. So that was our flight. I know that was a ton of information. We could have gone a little farther, more in depth in there. But again, it's just a very short information about flight. So we have one more left. So next week, December 19th from 3 to 4 p.m. Everyone that is here, even if you aren't watching today, anyone that registered will get an email from me and I will give you the link to register for the Science of Prairie Dogs next week. If you really liked this, we have our education YouTube channel, which I post all of those videos on. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, lots of good things. And also, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and we will see you next week for prairie dogs. I'm going to really quick stop sharing my screen here and see if there's any questions or comments. It always makes me nervous. Oh, someone said like about ballooning spiders. Yes, so ballooning spiders is also another thing. There's a lot of things we didn't even talk about insect movement today or flight. But yeah, ballooning spiders, they will use the wind currents to move in different areas. They'll send out that thing of silk. We talked a little bit about that in our Science of Orb Weavers a few weeks ago. So there's definitely small bits of it. But yeah, ballooning spiders, we didn't even touch insect flight today because that would have been like 3 hours in itself. But yeah, there's lots of things. If any of you, again, think of cool topics that you would like covered in a Science of, please let us know in those evaluations. And those are things that we could potentially cover in the future. Someone said, are there gliding squirrels on East Campus? Possibly. I know that they have found a few in a few oak trees that they've cut down just to get rid of that were old, and they do have some boxes set up, but I'm not sure what the status is on that. If you search on their website, I know they have a community science project that you might be able to find some information on. So, all right, well, if that's it. My voice is going, so I'm gonna let you guys go. I'll see you next week, December 19th, about prairie dogs. It will be our last one for the year. So please join us next week for prairie dogs. I'm very excited. They're so cool. And we will see you from 3 to 4 next week. Again, thanks everyone for showing up today. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday. So thank you. Bye, everyone.